One thing I'm going to throw in, because it is kind of relevant, but I don't have it in my slides, is I had the wonderful honor of being an advisor to director Davis Guggenheim in his early stages of conceptualizing Waiting for Superman. And if you haven't seen the movie, you should really go as a group and then go out to dinner afterward and really think about the levers that he proposes in that movie. I was an advisor. I wasn't the writer or final editor of that movie, so there's aspects of it that overall, I just think it's an unbelievable film. And there's nuances to it that I wish he could have explored more deeply. But I do urge you to, as a group, it just seems like a great field trip and a great way to build relationships and have a really focused conversation around something that's really important in this country right now and has a lot of momentum. I would also say that I'm kind of an unusual speaker because I've worked at the national level on this issue, working from kind of classroom to national policy level. And so you're all about driving to a focus, which I couldn't agree with more. But today, what I'm going to be doing is really helping you understand the context by which you're going to be kind of creating that focus, trying to give you as much kind of current understanding of what's happening in the larger landscape so that you can kind of begin to brainstorm and think about the tangible levers that might play out. So I'm happy to be part of the discussion of tangible levers. You're not going to see immediate tangible levers right here, but I think your synapses will start beginning to explore possibilities, and it'll be fun to be part of that process. So when Lindsay and I talked, she said she wanted me to speak to these key leverage points in education and what areas you all might focus on. And this is really tough, right? Because you have a small amount of money going into kind of the vast ocean of education change. I heard Melinda Gates speak last year, and she started out her speech saying, even Gates, who's spending billions of dollars on this issue, cumulatively, but just this year alone, hundreds of millions of dollars. Their budget is literally, I think, like $330 million will be spent on education change coming out of Gates. She described it as just a bucket of water into the ocean. And so leverage becomes really important. And having spent my entire career helping private philanthropists think about how they leverage their money, I always like to just remind people about what leverage means, because we throw around that word so much, it kind of has no meaning anymore. And so just two definitions I like. The one at the bottom, what's your strategic advantage? What power do you have to act effectively? I think these are really important questions to consider, especially when you're facing off with the unwieldy and intractable issues of education. But there's also this new definition I've stumbled across, which comes from the glossary for the War on Terror. Believe it or not, there is a glossary of terms. And leverage is in the glossary, and they have this actually great definition, which is the application of limited resources through a tactic intended to create magnified consequence. And this really is actually about a war on a system that just absolutely doesn't work and doesn't want to change. And there are all kinds of structural and policy and regulatory problems in the way that make it not want to change. I don't really actually see it fundamentally about teachers. I actually see it fundamentally about unbelievable constraints that exist for all good human beings to enact change in the system. And so I think that's a pretty important thing to begin with. Somewhat depressing, but an important reality to just really consider as you go into this work. So today I just want to inform and support your work. I want to provide context. I want to highlight just gargantuan changes in the education landscape in the last 20 months. More change in the landscape in the last 20 months than some would say in the last 30 years. Unbelievable. Unbelievable changes. Reframe the challenge then of what education reform is about in light of this totally radically different national and state context that we're living in and what the opportunity of that is, and then just be a resource as you start beginning to kind of frame your discussion about where this focus area is going to be. And I'm happy to be a resource today, but moving forward too, I'm at your on call. I love to. But the punchline today, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because everything I'm going to talk about next is going to be about this punchline. So right now you're just going to absorb this. For all students to succeed, and this is a group that said that it's about the achievement gap, and achievement gaps are usually code word for we want our low-income students and our students of color and our second language learners to succeed just like the rest of our students. That's what all students is code word for in our society right now. It's actually not very politically correct to talk about low-income students, black kids, and kids who don't speak English. So we talk about all kids, and what all kids really means is those kids. Those are the kids who truly the system is not serving, and they most depend on the system. to kind of break the cycle of poverty, illiteracy, and all kinds of other economic misfortune. So for all students to succeed, and if as a country we're actually serious about that, there's, a new movement underfoot that just basically says the public education system has to be fundamentally transformed, not reformed, transformed. And that this transformation needs to be focused on what is now being called, there's lots of words for it, but people are now using, key thought leaders, next generation learning, which implies a mass customization of learning enabled by technology that reimagines the nature of learning and the role of the teacher. Now, because we're sitting in Silicon Valley, I can say mass customization, and people don't go, oh, that's not right. You can't mass customize. Well, of course you can mass customize. Companies in the Valley have led the way and pioneered how that works, how you can individualize things at all different levels. But this idea that we might be mass customizing education and that driving toward a more personalized education model, giving the diversity of learners in our country, was kind of a radical notion in the last 10 years, but today, among policy leaders and thought leaders in this country, is increasingly more familiar, talked about a lot more. And I'm going to actually show you a video at the end of my talk that's just going to bring this to life. What would it look like to mass customize learning with a pilot project that's going on right now in New York City called the School of One, which is widely touted and has attracted enormous attention. So let's just start. Two things today, context and framing. Context first. We have this radically changed landscape, gargantuan changes in the last 20 months with unprecedented money. So let me just explain what the unprecedented money means. Politics aside, we all know that this country has just had this enormous stimulus package come forward. And when that stimulus package was put together, Obama saw an opportunity to actually put a piece of that stimulus package into the Department of Education. When he did so, he created for Secretary Duncan, former superintendent of Chicago schools, now our National Secretary of Education, he created for Arne Duncan the single largest budget for the Department of Education in its history. In fact, if you added up all of Arne Duncan's predecessors' annual budgets, he would still eclipse that budget aggregated. Okay, so add up everything his predecessors had, and he has way more. Unbelievable opportunity to send a very strong signal about what needs to happen next in this country in education. And he's done something pretty staggering, and I think both critics on the right and the left generally agree with this. When I read things out of the Fordham Institute or out of wherever, I think it's an interesting time because his agenda is very, very conservative in terms of the history of education reform. You wouldn't expect this agenda to be coming out of a Democratic administration. And that makes education in the Obama administration an exciting moment, because it may be the one thing that there can be some crossing of the aisles on, and there already has been some promise of that. And underneath all of this, it's hard to tell the story about what's happening without talking about the Gates Foundation. So before Obama ever became president, the Gates Foundation has been quietly laying the groundwork for everything that the U.S. Department of Education is now doing. In fact, the 4 pillars of the U.S. Department are the exact 4 pillars of the Gates strategy from before Obama ever came into office. The strategy of the foundation has directly, I would argue, transferred into the DOE. And with it, some of Gates' biggest intellectual, or some of the key intellectual capital at the Gates Foundation in education have also transferred to the Duncan administration. So you've had an enormous kind of shift of all this research and all this policy work that Gates has been laying the groundwork for moving into the administration. So to really understand what's happening in this country, it's actually really important to understand what's happening at the Gates Foundation. You can almost not tell the two apart. And there's lots of really interesting stories I could tell you about that, but just one, just as an example, in case you just can't fathom this or understand it. The Gates Foundation set out to make Common Core standards happen in this country. They began to map out a policy agenda about 4 years ago. Now, when I first arrived at Stupski 5 years ago, people told me Common Core standards would never happen. The Bush administration had managed to create 50 standards in the United States with No Child Left Behind, taking it out of tens of thousands of school districts and creating standards state by state. They said that's as far as the United States will go. Even though we know that every high-performing country in the world has common standards, even though we know that that's what it takes to be globally competitive, the United States will never do it. The governors will never go for it. Well, within 7 months of the administration coming into play, guess what? 48 governors agree to Common Core standards. Unbelievable. Great article by Walter Isaacson in Time magazine from last May about this coming into being and what an incredibly significant and jarring development it is. And it really sets the context for everything. Because by having common standards, you now have a marketplace that can actually compete in developing and innovating against those standards. So I'm sure in this room, lots of different industries are represented, and we know what the Valley has done in setting standards, for example, for green technology, and the kind of marketplace that then has emerged because of that. Well, education, having so many different standards, has never really been able to have any kind of R&D or innovation because the standards are dispersed. With Common Core standards, there's just an incredible ability for kind of the very best of breed technologies and insights and learning and education to come forward. So it's very, very exciting. So all this money's come in. The Gates Foundation is behind the scenes, fueling and funding a ton of things. Another really interesting little factoid is the Gates Foundation quietly funded 20 of their preferred states to get top-notch management consulting support for their race to the top applications. Who knew that, right? So McKinsey, Bain, Parthenon, Bridgespan were all put on retainer to support these states in their applications. Only 2 states won who didn't have Gates support, by the way. Hawaii being one of them, which was a total wild card. But anyway, but that's the kind of leverage Gates is pushing in this administration right now. So this is a lot of words on the page, but you have the U.S. Department of Education. You have them doing something where the groundwork was really laid by Gates, which is really pursuing kind of 3 things that I think are really fundamental new notions that the landscape seems to be acknowledging that they weren't acknowledging 20 months ago. This is about whole systems change. Yeah, everybody's talking about teacher quality in classrooms because that's what the public understands, but you cannot scale what happens in the classroom if the system doesn't change. You can't create multiple good shoe departments at Nordstrom if the home office doesn't understand how to do that, right? How to hire, how to train, how to replicate that process. We know in companies this happens all the time. It doesn't happen in our U.S. school system. So this idea that you would have to support whole system change, which No Child Left Behind, one of its biggest failures was it was never able, when it created a new mandate that all children would succeed in the system, it never funded that mandate with any kind of systems change. So it's literally, you know, like a company declaring that all employees are going to do something, but then never making any structural changes to actually make that happen. It feels like nonsense, because it actually is. There's also a whole new dialogue, and Waiting for Superman begins to really open up this discussion about global competitiveness. So in fact, yeah, we're talking about this achievement gap, but when the kids who are actually succeeding, the middle class and upper middle class kids, are actually not succeeding at a level that makes them competitive for the top jobs in this country, that's pretty demoralizing. And so in fact, the achievement gap, to me, is kind of very passé. It doesn't actually mean anything, because when the ceiling is so low, who cares? Who cares about the gap? So now we're helping everybody be mediocre. Great. Well, maybe there's a chance to help everybody be globally competitive, to just actually fundamentally change the whole system so that we're actually preparing our country and our kids to be globally competitive. And then in the midst of this, there is a lot of discussion at the political level and in the foundation sector, the philanthropic center, about the lowest performing kids. How do we get more kids graduating from high school? How do we get more kids taking AP courses and passing AP exams as proxies for kind of achievement? How do we move that along? So these are kind of 3 really important trends that you weren't hearing a whole lot about, and now there's a lot more discussion about them. The blue is the 4 pillars that I talked about earlier. So the 4 key Gates strategies that then transferred to the DOE are standards and assessment. Common Core begins the political path toward global competitiveness. I think everybody who's had any look at the early work of the Common Core in both math and literacy would say, yeah, it's a good start, but we're a long way from getting to global competitiveness, but it's a political path. You have to start somewhere. So standards and assessment starts with the Common Core standards that we're now adopting in this country. Everybody but Alaska and Texas has signed on. True. and
this is where it all funded.
yeah, and so that's what you see there. Data systems, of course, to make anything work, you got to have good data. You got to be able to track kids. You got to be able to track them when they change districts, when they change schools. So upping the ante on data systems is critical. You hear a lot about teacher quality, but in fact, if you read the DOE pillars, it's teacher and principal quality. And we all know that teachers will say that, you know, they stay about as long as they stay if they have a good boss or not. And I think if you employ any people, you know that people stay. It's directly, people's tenure is usually predicated on the fact that they had a good or bad boss. People stay when they have a good boss. And then school turnaround, just tons of underperforming schools in this country. The opportunity to have new regulations, new incentives, new opportunities for turnaround, lifting some of the barriers that exist in turning schools around for the lowest performing schools to help them have a chance to begin to get their scores up. And then on the bottom is this idea of next generation or personalized learning again. If you were to go to the Gates website, you'd still see these things kind of embedded. They've been morphing their strategies. This stuff still lives there. It's not as blatant anymore. But a huge emphasis on next generation learning at the Gates Foundation. A whole division dedicated to that purpose. And the former head of the next generation group at Gates is now the head of the Innovation Fund in the Education Department under Arnie Duncan. So very interesting sharing of intellectual capital. So I have a handout that I'm going to share with Jill, and she can decide if it would be helpful to all of you. But there's a woman named Stephanie Pace-Marshall who's done a really nice job against like 15 different kind of dimensions of the school system, showing what it means to reform versus what it means to transform. So if you kind of break out aspects of the school system. But her fundamental argument is that reforming is to improve, did I get, there's a typo there, but it's the correction of an error, the removal of a defect, to improve conditions without radical change. So this is kind of the language of let's just improve our schools. Transformation is to fundamentally change the nature, character, function, and condition of our system to create fundamentally different schools. And I gave you that initial kind of takeaway at the beginning, which I'll bring up after we watch our video, which is the next generation learning really implies that schools would be totally different. You know, our education system was initially designed in an agrarian society to help people be literate. Then it was modified a bit for the industrial age to help people be prepared for a variety of things, one of which was to go to college. We haven't really fundamentally altered the system since then. So when the No Child Left Behind mandate came in, this is perfect, and mandated that all children would succeed in the system. Think about how radical that is, to have that mandate and then to really have no opinion on how the system should change to accommodate that goal. It's, like I said, it's nonsense. But if you think about your children, if you have children, or your grandchildren, or your nieces and nephews, or your friends next door, the kinds of requirements that learners now have, the competition for their time in terms of things that are enormously more interesting than sitting in school. I think everyone kind of intuitively knows that sitting in a classroom with a teacher who actually isn't expert in anything, trying to convey really important information when in 2 seconds you could log on to an MIT website and have a world-renowned scientist explaining the same thing to you. That just something isn't really working about this system anymore when you're living in a landscape where there's so much possibility. And the good news is that people all over the country are beginning to realize this, and I think it's a really important context, and I hope it's pretty obvious why I've gone to this place with this group, that in a region like this and in a location like this, a group of funders might begin to really tangibly think about how their funding could begin to play out in this landscape in practical and tangible ways by looking for levers that begin to promote this kind of agenda and begin to kind of play off and leverage what's happening in this landscape. I would also just briefly go back to this slide and say that all the money right now at the federal level is going toward those 4 pillars. So all the race to the top money drives toward those things. So those are really important levers right now because everybody's attention is on them. And I would argue to actually fund outside these levers might be very difficult to get the sincere kind of commitment of folks. Because this is what people both in and outside the system who are supporting the changes are focused on right now. So I think that whatever you do, you have to be thinking about how it ties into what's going on. Even though California is in a race to the top state, just by filling out the application, they've made some pretty radical commitments to these areas. And I think there's a lot of consensus in these areas. Okay, so we're going to watch a video now that will hopefully drive this home. And to do that, you're going to pull it up.
I hope it has enough sound.
Okay.
Hold, do you mind grabbing the lights? Is it hard to
Did we test the sound? No.
I didn't, actually.
Okay.
But I couldn't have done anything about it anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
No. This is about 4.5 minutes.
I've been a teacher for 5 years, and I think one of the biggest challenges that a teacher faces in a traditional classroom is having to deal with the different learning styles as well as differentiating instruction so that they can reach out to all the different students in their one classroom.
The mission of School of One is to provide students with personalized, effective, and dynamic classroom instruction so that students learn in ways that are customized to their academic needs and learning styles.
We began by just asking ourselves questions like, what subjects do we want to do this in? How long are the periods going to be? Where are students going to put their backpacks? In the end, we had over 600 questions that served as our roadmap for getting to our summer pilot. We wanted to do this in one school, in one subject, for one grade, in one space, and in a school that already had one computer for every student.
He's the head of human resources for all of New York City, so he's the leader of this initiative.
96 grade students enrolled in the first School of One program that would focus exclusively on math. It's one of 7 middle schools in New York City that was both hosting a summer program in 2009 and had a 1-to-1 ratio of computers to students.
So when I first heard it, I'm like, wait a minute, can that be done? So I was actually very excited with this idea that, okay, if we put a pilot program at MS 131, would you willing to try it? And of course I will. Who won't?
I like that.
The team began by carefully analyzing assessment data for each student in the program. Based on that analysis, the team identified the most appropriate set of skills that each would focus on during the summer. This is called the playlist, but it was only the beginning of the process.
In order to get a clear picture of the whole student, they took a lot of surveys, and a lot of this information went into their profile, from the data from their assessment, how well they did on the math test, to personal surveys about likes and dislikes, both in and outside the classroom. And all of these things were put together to form a profile.
As the assessment team developed each student's individual playlist and learning profile, the content team began to source learning activities from several different partners. Lessons are offered through large group instruction, small group instruction, one-on-one tutoring, virtual teaching online, collaborative group activities, and educational software. By the first day of the program, over 1,000 lessons were in the system and ready for deployment. Figuring out how to match each student's profile to the most effective instructional content, and in a way that worked inside a classroom, was the most challenging part of the School of One pilot.
What makes this program special is the sort of the undergirding technology behind the program, which is this learning algorithm, which basically takes multiple data points from students and from teachers and from parents about students, and comes out with basically an optimal learning schedule for each student each day.
So what the learning algorithm does is looks at it from a different angle. So it says, you know, James really likes to learn using basketball examples, and he is a really good, you know, he likes to learn visually. So we're able to take specific lessons that are catered to James and give them to him.
The learning algorithm generates a unique schedule for each student each day that is projected on monitors located throughout the space. With the profile, the content, and the learning algorithm in place, the final challenge was working through all of the operations for the summer pilot. The School of One team worked with some of the country's top architects on the space requirements for both the summer pilot and for fitting within existing sites. Now it was time to convert the architectural renderings into plans. On July 6, 2009, School of One officially launched. Students received an orientation to explain how School of One worked, learned how the space was organized, and received their own playlist. Each day, the process got easier and easier.
My job last year was to check on the student security scores, to try to figure out which performance indicators need to be taught, to assess them afterwards to figure out what they know, to plan the instruction, to provide the materials, and then to do the actual instruction. As a teacher today, what I experienced was being able just to focus on the delivery of instruction.
Being a graduate student and a teacher to be, this is a perfect first place to start. I can actually have an opportunity in a smaller group to gauge reaction.
By taking away the staging and the prep work and a lot of the planning decisions that are made, based on data, what you're doing is you're freeing up the teacher to do what they're here for and what they do best and what they love doing, which is just teach. And the feedback from them has been really positive.
Math is kind of not my strongest subject, and it is hard. And being in this program, I noticed has helped me improve in my math, my division, and everything else. I think that will be helpful in the future.
I really do think I'm getting better at math because, like, my adding is getting better, and my division and my fractions are getting way better than they used to be.
I think the idea is very grandiose. It's such an exciting and innovative way of teaching. It's the new generation of teaching. I mean, my biggest question is, how come this hasn't happened before?
None of this matters if you don't deliver student outcomes. That's the ultimate barometer of success. We are just at the very beginning stages of learning about mass customization of student learning. But we do need a bit of time to figure this out. I know we're not going to have the answers after a 20-day summer program. We are incredibly excited about what we're going to learn from the School of One pilot and the results that we'll see, but even more excited now that we know what we know about where this can go.
So this final list is interesting because you're going to see a lot of your friends on the list. Cisco's involved in this, and then there's another slide that comes up.
Why is this to happen in New York City first?
Because Joel Rose, the head of Human Capital, had this idea, and his superintendent gave him money to pilot it. And I think what's really interesting is he's the director of Human Capital for the entire district. So he's framing this. He comes from a human capital, right, kind of perspective, and the idea that he would be reimagining the role of the teacher and the principal and the school leadership, starting from that vantage point to launch this innovation in New York City schools, I think is really fascinating.
I just wanted to clarify, make sure I understood. Was it just math that they were teaching in this new way?
They were doing this first pilot using just math.
And was it for all the middle school students in the school?
No, it was for a group of disadvantaged students who were spending the summer who needed math enrichment. So it was done as a summer pilot, and then it was opened up as a middle school, as I understand. They added more kids in the fall and then in the winter, so they're beginning to now expand the program. It also just won an innovation grant from the U.S. Department of Education, so there's been race to the top states and grants that have been made. There has been now a set of innovation money that has come out of the department, and then the final pool of money there's lots of pulls, but the final big significant pull of money is around assessment. So how do you create robust assessments to measure the standards that are coming out? So those are the three pulls of money out of the feds. So I started off by just saying, this idea that for all students succeed, the system needs to be fundamentally transformed, and that there is this movement afoot, both to get Race to the Top up and running and to improve teacher and principal quality, standards and assessments, data systems, and school turnaround. But there's also kind of a major landscape shift with, I think, a significant group of players who are now pushing to think about this next generation learning agenda. And it's definitely on the edge of the mainstream right now, but a very important development in the landscape that I thought was important enough to kind of make the focus of today's talk. And, I started to think about, to kind of jumpstart the discussion that Jill and Nancy are going to lead about levers, which is, okay, what is private philanthropy uniquely positioned to do to kind of advance this next generation learning work? And some of it would be funding creation of new models within the system. So what I love about the example you just saw is it's an in-system example. It's not an example that's floating out there, but it's an in-system example. And I know, having traveled around both California and other states, that superintendents have a lot of these garage experiments going on. I was down in Pomona and with a former employee of mine who was the superintendent of Pomona schools, and one of the first things she wanted to do was show me her very alternative high school, very school of one-ish high school in a shopping mall the district had owned that had kind of gone under, and she had converted it to this basically, open space where students who worked could come in and out, have individualized learning plans, and go through their education with coaches and facilitators who had been teachers in classrooms in the high school down the street previously. So these little experiments are happening. When you talk to leaders in the system, they'll say, oh, we have one or two of these kind of emerging. Nothing as robust as this New York model, but still promising. Looking at charter models with this approach, supporting new models of teaching, models that begin to kind of push the envelope of what teachers are prepared to do, or bring in a generation of teachers who are more prepared to move toward this role as these changes start to happen, and supporting recruitment and related to that, quality teachers. Of course, there's really practical alternatives that have to be considered in California right now, so I don't want to underplay the fact that the California budget is decimated. Services for the kinds of kids that you all care about and that are a huge part of the student population in the Valley, those services, after-school services, in-school services, all kinds of things are being diminished right now. And there are, I think, really important conversations to be had about what a role a group like this might have in helping to continue those services if, when they're at risk of disappearing. Whether that's high leverage enough for you, I think, is an important trade-off to think about. But it is an important discussion to have, and one I would certainly support, as well as all kinds of other things that might be generated by you all thinking about this context and what it might mean for you all. So that's the end of my formal comments, and Lindsay's got my email in case people want to follow up or be in touch with me. But I'll just be staying to be a resource for the discussion.
Thank you.
So, now, like, okay. Let's.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I've heard, and I don't know the answer, maybe some of the pushback that I've received when I've talked about waiting for Superman, and talked about, all states accepting new national standards except Texas and Alaska. What I've heard is from some people that, California has lowered their standards, in fact, that reduced our standards, and we're 48th on the list because, in fact, we've had higher standards, and if you really compared us to an Alabama, we'd be ahead of them for, whatever reason. Did you comment on that earlier?
No, I didn't, but
Could you?
But that's true, but I would say there's a different way to explain it.
Right.
So there are a lot of states where accepting the Common Core was a no-brainer because they already were far above that. Massachusetts is probably the best example. I don't think anyone would argue that Massachusetts has some of the best, most rigorous standards in the country. And so Massachusetts accepting the Common Core was a no-brainer. It's meant to be a floor, not a ceiling. So they signed on right away. I mean, it's like, sure, what else are, but a state like Massachusetts is also saying we're really looking to push toward global competitiveness. So we're great at getting on board with this, but we're really looking at who's going to help us kind of break the next box in terms of standards, assessments, and where the data systems are going. In California, I think it's a mixed bag. California has tons of standards. I think the biggest criticism of California is they're a mile wide and an inch deep. And we know that the best performing countries in the world, the standards are fewer, they're more rigorous, they're deeper, fewer and deeper. And all of the research out of Stanford, Linda Darling Hammond, and others shows that the fewer and deeper is clearly the winning game. So Common Core is also meant to kind of create a cultural shift away from the mile wide, inch deep. And I'm not an expert on standards, but that would be my layman's kind of translation of that critique. It's a little more nuanced. But in fact, what you said is true. There are some California standards that would be considered more rigorous, but our teachers are drowning in standards, and so there's this mediocrity that prevails. And so part of it is kind of challenging the states to do the fewer, deeper. But so there's a good white paper that I think Vicki Phillips, she's given, the head of the Gates Foundation Education Unit, she's given a lot of speeches on this, or, and other people in the administration have as well.
You're probably in a great position to comment on this. Do you see the kind of system that the School of One is supporting also addressing the needs of kids with learning differences?
I haven't been able to look at the School of One model that closely, but based on all of the design elements, I would say absolutely. It looks like a heck of a more interesting model for kids with learning problems than
as well as gate kids.
Yeah.
So they are trying to encompass that,
so
as well as just kind of meeting the basic standards.
So the differentiation. Well, I think those aren't exclusive things. To meet the standards, what you want is multiple pathways for kids to get there based on their learning profile. So what's powerful about School of One is they start with a robust learning profile. They know a kid likes art and basketball and is better at math, and they can actually draw from their lesson bank. I know the audio was hard on this, but the lesson bank has been tagged to say this is a lesson that would be good for kids that have these kinds of profiles. So this idea of an individual student passport, an individual student profile that's well known, when we think about that just seems like common sense, right? But we don't do that in our public education system. The idea that the adults in the system have spent a lot of time creating individualized profiles, that it's enabled by technology to make it efficient, and then matching those profiles to data banks of lessons, all driving to the same standards. Everybody's mastering the same thing. Everybody's held accountable to master the basics of math that get you to Algebra 1 in 9th grade so you can be on track for college entrance, right? If a kid isn't ready for Algebra 1 in 9th grade, they're not going to college. So everybody's got to hit the same standards, but the pathway to get there is going to be really different for different kids.
It's interesting you mentioned Algebra 1 by 9th grade, because a lot of the out-of-school time programs that spoke to us talked about Algebra 1 by 8th grade.
Yeah.
And I have a question in my mind whether that's right for every kid.
Yeah, I've heard the common, there could be new thinking about that. I've spent a lot of time with math scholars in this area, 8th, 9th grade. I think the idea is to get kids on track.
Yeah.
Whether how significant that nuance is, I'm not sure, but it's an interesting point.
The other difference I hear here, so much focus has been on class size and getting smaller class size, or if you're with a KIPP school, it might be a larger class size, but they have it very structured. That's not what we're hearing here.
Well, the research, waiting for Superman goes into this, the research actually shows that if you have a bad teacher, class size doesn't matter. Just doesn't matter. Now, what I think we don't discuss enough in this country is if you have a good teacher,
they don't have as much time.
Yeah, that class size, I think, is really important to good teachers. And I don't have any research to back that up, but I know my sister is a very powerful teacher. It makes a really big difference when they have 3 kids to her class, her ability to kind of create the kind of achievement she wants. That's very anecdotal. But I think the key is that lowering class size does not change the outcomes if you have a bad teacher. That's really the key insight. And I think there's a big debate about what good teachers need. And I think that some of the reasons teachers are offended by waiting for Superman, the teachers I talk to are offended, I would consider really good teachers, very committed. They believe all children can learn. They are in the system for the right reasons. And I think the film is difficult because it doesn't talk about what good teachers need to succeed.
Right.
And it's a huge kind of void in the movie. And, the movie he could have gone a lot of different places. He decided to keep it editorially to where it was, and I understand why he did that. But I think that's unfortunate. That piece is unfortunate. We don't talk about that much.
That's a quick question. Part of what we perceive as our value for SB2 is that we work with nonprofits to try to provide some value in terms of promoting organizational capacity building. Are there areas among the 4 pillars that you're seeing locally? We also operate locally as opposed to the levels you've been operating nationally, where you're seeing nonprofits, and again, our limit's somewhere in the 500 to 3 million size, where you're seeing some innovation in nonprofits locally that you've either been involved from a funding perspective or from a due diligence perspective in some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, I knew I was going to get this question, and I'm really not poised to answer it. I actually sent out quite a few emails to colleagues last week to say, where are you, given the constraints of this group, where are you seeing this?
Right.
I almost felt like throwing my talk out after I got some of the feedback I got, because people were having a hard time coming up with stuff. I decided, though, that it was really important to push and challenge you in this area, and I'm not going to be able to solve that problem. I'm more than willing to use my connections to push a little further. I mean, a couple emails came back and said, everybody should look at Rocket Ship. I think Rocket Ship has some of these elements, which is a charter model that's getting a lot of attention here in San Jose.
Which is part of our charter school consortium.
Yeah. So, and there were a few other mentions, but it was interesting. People actually were going outside the region. They weren't meeting my parameters that I put in my email, which was kind of frustrating. So I thought, no, that one's actually outside. So I think there might be an opportunity to try to be a little Pollyanna about this, to potentially take some high-performing nonprofits who really want to do this work. There's a lot of pent-up demand, and people go with kind of where the money and the trends are. I could almost see you maybe issuing an RFP to see if there were interest in existing organizations to move in this direction, or stuff they were already doing that they wanted to deepen. And what you would do in doing that is you would elicit a lot of interesting response. It would get people thinking about the issue and pondering what piece of it they're doing and where they could strengthen it. And there might be an interesting kind of leverage in just getting a conversation going and beginning to do an audit of who's interested in this issue in the Valley. Sometimes an RFP has this really interesting advantage of surfacing a pool of people that you didn't know were thinking about an issue or weren't blatantly focused on it if you looked on their website. So we often use that at Stupski and other places I've been to try to figure out, are there innovators that are hiding out that you want to kind of bring forward by simply offering the chance to compete for some money.